Hello, I'm Jane Denning and I'm going to read the first chapter of Tomorrow's Guardian. Chapter 1. The Dream. Lieutenant Edward Dyson was fighting for his life amongst the cook fires and tents of the army's camp. A huge Zulu warrior screamed as he charged toward him, a spear held menacingly in his hand. Edward sidestepped to dodge the attack and clipped the enemy on the back of the head with the butt of his revolver. The blow sent the warrior stumbling to the ground. Edward shook his head in disbelief. How had it come to this? Not 4 hours before, he had been one of an army of well over 1,000 highly trained and well-armed soldiers. Now, almost all were dead. Yesterday, the army had advanced this far from Rorke's Drift with little sight of the enemy. Last night, they set up camp here on the plain beneath the conical-shaped mountain of Isandlwana. His fellow officers had invited friends from the 2nd Battalion over for drinks to celebrate the rare event of 2 battalions from the same regiment serving overseas together. The last time that had happened, the 24th had almost been wiped out in a battle against the Sikhs in India. Someone had joked that they hoped it did not happen again this time. Not that this was likely. Indeed, it was preposterous. Surely these Zulus, facing the might of Queen Victoria's British Empire, were nothing more than savages with spears and wicker shields. Rapid-firing, breech-loading Martini Henry rifles, artillery, rocket batteries and well-trained light cavalry would be more than a match for these barbarians. Edward had thought so, but all that soon changed. Late in the morning, a squadron of Natal cavalry attached to the British expedition had been scouting far out on the plain, perhaps half a mile or so from the camp. Cresting a rise, one of the patrols suddenly came across thousands of Zulus hiding and resting in a valley. As one, the Zulus rose and hurtled up the slope towards the horsemen, who fell back in alarm and then started exchanging rifle fire with them. The enemy had few firearms and were poor shots, while the British were superb marksmen, but the sheer number of Zulus forced the horsemen back towards the camp. Soon whole regiments of Zulus emerging all along the British front. The red-coated soldiers formed up into a firing line and began shooting at the natives. The brave enemy warriors fell in droves, but still they came on, as unstoppable as a tidal wave, as irresistible as a glacier. Only the devastating volleys from the British companies kept them back, for the moment. By now, Edward was learning a new respect for this enemy. His men and those of the other companies were inflicting dozens of casualties with each shot, but the Zulus did not run away. Instead, he could hear them chanting their terrifying war cry, an angry buzzing noise that sounded rather like a swarm of infuriated wasps on a hot summer's day. The order now came to fall back 500 yards to the camp. Some of the companies moved more quickly than others, creating wide gaps between them. Furthermore, Edward became aware that his men were running low on ammunition. They were sharing out the rounds they had and trying to continue shooting as they retreated. Overall, the result was a slackening of the fire upon the enemy. Suddenly, with a great cry of "Usulu!" almost 20,000 Zulus surged forward in a charge on all fronts. The British were quite unable to stop them, and entire companies disappeared, swept away as if that tidal wave had finally come crashing down upon them. So it was that Edward now found himself fighting in the chaos of his camp. He fired his revolver at a fierce-looking brute who just stabbed a redcoat, saw him fall, and then looked about for his men. 3 were fighting in a small triangle 20 yards away, one firing whilst another reloaded, and the third threatened a score of Zulus with his bayonet. A moment later, all three fell to the blades of the vengeful Zulus. To his right, a cook and his assistant were swinging cleavers widely and shouting in terror that they were not soldiers. But it did not save them. The Zulus came upon them, stabbing with their short spears. As his compatriots died, Edward realised he was alone. He glanced around in horror. Above him, the sky had turned a dark, angry red. 50 enemy warriors closed in on him from all around. His mouth felt dry. Shaking with fear, he fired his revolver, heard the hammer click on an empty chamber. He fumbled for his sword, knowing he had only moments to live. "Tom, wake up, lad, wake up now. Your friends will be here soon." Tom Oakley opened his eyes, sat up in bed and stared wildly around his room, taking in the PC in the corner, a heap of abandoned clothes and trainers on the floor, and the Nintendo DS on the bedside cabinet. Finally, he turned to where his father stood at the open door and gave him a bewildered stare. His father's eyes narrowed, and he came and sat on his son's bed. Reaching over, he swept Tom's hair to one side and touched his forehead to see if he felt hot. "What is it, lad? Did you have another of those nightmares?" Tom nodded. "One of those dreams when you think you're someone else?" "They seem so real, Dad," Tom answered. His father frowned, searching his face. "They're just dreams, boy, nothing more," he said at last, getting to his feet. "Come on, get dressed." He paused at the door and turned to look back at Tom before adding, "Oh yes, happy birthday, son." Tom rolled out of bed, walked over to his mirror and stared at his reflection. For a moment he was almost surprised to see the young lad with brown eyes and jet black hair staring back at him. Why surprised, though? Was he expecting another face? He rubbed his eyes, yawned, and then moved away to get dressed. It was a warm day in early spring, so he held his birthday party in the garden. He and his friends played football and then cricket until he slogged a 6 over the fence and lost the ball. That turned out to be the signal for tea. There was the usual party food, including cakes and ice cream, along with his father's homemade burgers, cooked and half burnt on a barbecue. Then, of course, there was the cake. It was baked in the shape of a Dalek, and as his mother walked out of the kitchen door carrying it, there were shouts of "Great" and "Wow" from his friends. The words "Happy birthday, happy 11th birthday, Tom" were written in blue icing on the top. His mother now started singing, "Happy birthday to you," and all the boys joined in. His oldest friend, James, was singing along with the alternative words, "You live in a zoo," and Tom stuck his tongue out and blew a raspberry at him. James simply smiled and sang louder. Tom bent forward, took a deep breath, then blew all 11 candles out. His mother put down the cake and turned to take a knife to cut it into slices. That was when it happened. The world seemed to give a slight judder up and forwards, and Tom felt as if he was being thrust backwards, like he was in a car that had suddenly accelerated, pushing him back against the seat. Feeling dizzy, he closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he blinked, because right there in front of him was the cake, with all the candles still burning brightly. Around him the boys were singing, "Happy birthday to Thomas, happy birthday to you," and cheering. He was convinced they were all playing a trick on him. All the boys were in on it, and his mother must have used those party trick candles that keep relighting themselves. That was the explanation, obviously. He leant forward and blew the candles out again, and then went over to give James a friendly slap on the top of his head. "Hey," James muttered, rubbing his crown. "Just for that, I won't keep a lookout for Rogers." Kyle Rogers was a bully and Tom's enemy. Only 2 months older, but about 2 foot taller and much wider too, or so it seemed to Tom, who had been only 8 when he had ridden his bike round the corner of the street without looking and almost knocked Kyle over. The other boy just had time to jump out of the path, straight into the milk bottles outside Mrs. Brown's house, smashing 2 and ending up sitting in the milk. A charging bull would have moved less quickly. Kyle had exploded at Tom, kicking him off his bike and onto the road, and then laying into him with his bunched fists, before Mrs. Brown came out of the door and chased them both away. Tom ran home with a bleeding nose and did not go out for a week. From that moment on, Kyle took every opportunity to corner Tom and make his life a misery. Fortunately, James was around him most of the time, and Kyle did not bother to take them both on. But he still found ways to get at Tom, like sniggering him in class when he made mistakes. They were now in the last term at primary school, and so Tom endured the jibes, thinking he did not have to put up with them for much longer. The summer holidays were fast approaching, and it seemed that Kyle was going to a different school in the autumn. "I'm much cleverer than you, Oakley," he chortled. "I'm off to King John's Grammar School in the autumn, not that smelly old comp down the road you two are going to." For the next few weeks after the party, Tom and James enjoyed counting down the days until their time with Kyle Rogers would finally be over. Kyle said nothing and just smiled at them. He left it till the very last day at the old school to find Tom in the toilets. Then he walked up and thumped him on the arm. "Ouch! What was that for, Rogers?" Tom asked, rubbing his shoulder. "Just something to remember me by, Oakley. Until next term, of course." "What do you mean, next term?" "Oh, didn't I mention that I'm going to Parklands Comp as well?" "What? You said you were going to King John's," Tom said, feeling his heart sinking. Kyle smirked. "Nah, was having you on. I couldn't miss out on keeping you company for the next 7 years." He added with another vicious punch, this time to Tom's belly. Tom collapsed onto the toilet floor, and Kyle walked out, laughing, then turned to add a parting shot. "Have a good summer, Oakley. I'll see you in September." Tom dragged himself to his feet and groaned. Kyle at the same school for the next 7 years. Somehow the summer holidays didn't seem long enough. If the strangely real dreams and the event at the birthday party back in April were the only odd things to have occurred, Tom might have forgotten about them. But a few weeks later, the peculiar feeling, like sudden acceleration, happened again. He was on holiday with his parents and his sister Emma in Spain. They were playing a game of cricket on the beach with some new friends who were also on holiday, watched by a group of puzzled Spanish kids. Tom was bowling as Mike, a boy from London who was staying at the same hotel, took strike with the bat. Tom ran up and bowled. Mike swung his bat and missed the ball, which clattered through the wicket, sending the stumps flying. Emma cheered and clapped, and their father, sitting on a towel nearby, shouted, "Well bowled!" Then again Tom felt the judder and strange feeling of being thrust backwards. He blinked and opened his eyes, and now saw that he was once more at the beginning of his run-up, the ball still in his hand. Mike was standing, bat at the ready, waiting for him to bowl, and behind him the stumps were still intact. Tom was about to shout to Mike that he was out, and what was he doing still at the stumps, when, abruptly, he felt dizzy, and the world seemed to spin like a fairground. A moment later, he was lying on the sand with his father and all the kids around him. His father picked him up and carried him to one of their rented sun lounges. "You're right, Tom," said his father. Except somehow he didn't sound like his dad. The world seemed very peculiar, though he could not exactly say in what way. It was just odd.